Perfect. Awesome. Wow. Okay. Takes a little teamwork. Well, first of all, Matthew Rosa, thank you so much for being here. For those of you who don't know, Matthew Rosa is an esteemed writer for multiple publications, but he is also a staff writer for Salon.com. He writes about science, health, politics, history. He is also a film critic. That's the reason partly why Matthew Rosa, we asked Matthew Rosa to come join us here. Contributing to Salon's cultural vertical the cultural vertical regularly in the past, albeit less frequently today, and continuing to post reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, as well as on his personal site, which I believe is MatthewRosa.com, right? Or NotRosa.com.
It's Matthew.
MatthewRosa.com. I'll circulate that in the announcements on Blackboard. Matthew would like to tell us that his favorite movie is Unbreakable, and the least favorite movie is Smiley. Those of you who've seen this movie. Matthew thinks that Martin Scorsese is a genius, but absolutely wrong about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Matthew's biggest regret as a critic was initially panning the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse film, but his biggest point of pride is panning music, the review that we all read for today. Okay? In addition to being a film critic of more than 140 film reviews, I believe that are all links on the Rotten Tomatoes site, for outlets from Salon to MSNBC and more. Matthew, I think, is also a great commentator on popular culture and politics as well. Rosa has interviewed multiple notable people, including President Jimmy Carter, Roger Stone, political campaign organizer, the cast of Sesame Street, as well as cast of SpongeBob, and Temple Grandin. Those of you who don't know who Temple Grandin is, this is the scientist who developed the COVID-19 vaccine. So we are very, very honored to have Matthew Rosa here to talk about films, which is among his passions. So maybe you can give warm welcome to Matthew Rosa, please.
Thank you so much. Those were very kind words. I'm very flattered and I'm honored to be here. Brian and I go back since we were both students at Rutgers Newark. We had a common professor, Gotham Rao, and it is a pleasure joining him again academically, albeit in a virtual context none of us could have imagined in 2011. So anyway, do you want me to just start speaking? Is that the way I should proceed?
I mean, we can have this. I envision this to be like a kind of a free format. I have a couple of questions. Maybe we can start by, if you can tell us a little bit about your journey about becoming a professional writer from graduate school, and perhaps what kind of challenges you faced along this journey as well.
Absolutely. A lot of it, and I know this is a cliche, but it is true, is what matters is who you know. I was very lucky. There are a lot of talented writers out there. I happened to write an article for a local newspaper, my local newspaper, the Allentown Morning Call, that was noticed by the CEO of a website called policymike.com. Now it's just mike.com. And he sent me an email and said, we're starting this organization. It focuses on millennial writers. Would you be interested in joining? And I seized the opportunity. So it was a combination of writing an article that at least this person thought was good, and then when an opportunity was offered, seizing the moment. So a lot of it really is just luck. And I'm not saying that to be discouraging. Actually, it is encouraging, because if you keep putting yourself out there, eventually you'll get lucky. And that was like, I was thinking earlier, what advice would I really give? And it is, if you just keep writing and writing and writing and writing and getting and submitting your work to people and acknowledging that this industry does have a lot of people who are toxic. And so there are people who will try to put you down. It doesn't matter if you're the second coming of Mark Twain, it's going to happen. But if you have a thick skin and you are persistent, eventually the right person at the right time will notice you. And that's what happened to me. It was in very early 2012, like right as the year began, I got noticed by Policy Mike. I I wrote for them for about 2 years. And then for the next 2 years, I freelanced for a number of organizations. I've been a staff writer exclusively at Salon since 2016. And in terms of film criticism, some of the earliest articles that I wrote for Salon were movie reviews. Actually, the first movie that I remember reviewing for them was the original The Avengers, the 2012 movie that kind of kicked off this whole MCU craze that we're now in as a culture. At Salon, I wrote a review for another Avengers movie, Infinity War, that was very popular. It went viral. I did not like the movie, which went against the grain of popular opinion. And so it got a lot of attention, and I was asked to write movie reviews more regularly. And also, a lot of pop culture intersects with politics, it intersects with history, it intersects with science. And these are things that I already covered through my career. So it was an opportunity to approach these subjects through something that I'm passionate about and always have been, but also from a somewhat different angle. And part of the reason I selected at least some of the reviews that I did is because those are occasions when I explored movies that had an intersection with social issues or with political issues. And one of the other pieces of advice I would give just in general is to always meet deadlines, which sounds like, again, trite, but something I've noticed in my career is the people who succeed are the ones who are reliable. It sounds like a little thing, but there are a lot of very talented writers who aren't reliable. If you are talented and you're reliable, you will always be given preference over the talented person who isn't reliable. So it sounds like a little thing, but it's a competitive industry. And if you want that edge and you know you're talented, also make sure that you're dependable, because if you're dependable, that will give you an advantage. And that's true for everything in life, not just writing.
I just wanted to mention quickly that the first deadline for this class is 11/2. So make sure you get those deadlines in for your first film review. So thank you. You're also an academic too. So how do you bridge those worlds, both as a professional writer and as an academic? Is there common ground there, or is your research very much different from what you're doing in the public sphere?
There is some bridge. I mean, this deals less with film criticism, but right now I'm ABD in a PhD program at Lehigh. I got my master's at the same university as Ryan. And I would say it's been more important when it comes, especially to discussing politics and because right now, between the recent election and the pandemic, between climate change and all of this civil unrest, there is an unprecedented, we're in a very historic moment. And having an academic background has helped me provide context to news rather than just reporting on current events. I try to place them in a broader perspective. So we're looking beyond the years 2020 and 2021. We're looking at decades and centuries, and that can provide you with a different point of view.
And that's the kind of assignment that we're doing here with our film reviews, essentially placing these films in their historical context and their significance in terms of a broader cultural field, in that sense, but both in political sense, but also in the cultural sense. So I mean that would be a key insight that you derive from, or at least attempt in your film reviews. I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about your process with film reviewing. Could you walk us through your process with film reviewing? It sounds like sometimes you're asked to write film reviews, but are you sometimes selecting those films on your own?
Well, the process is different now than it was when I was writing reviews more regularly. For instance, the review for music, I'm on the autism spectrum, and I often cover neurodiversity and disability rights. So it just seemed like a logical fit. I mean, the reason when I reviewed Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, I was writing film reviews regularly, and I mean, it was this obscure indie film, but I thought it deserved attention. So I took a professional risk and reviewed the. I'm being sarcastic. I'm not seeing anyone acknowledging this, and I don't want people saying film critic from Salon thought no one had heard of Star Wars. So I want to be very clear that that was a joke. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, obviously I had to review that. In terms of the process of writing reviews, I will say your mood does influence how you view a movie, and that's something to be aware of, because you want to make sure that you're as detached as possible. Like I know there are some people who are worried that if they review a film that they'll have a bias in favor or against it. I've never had that issue. I would say the bigger issue is always making sure that when you watch a movie that you're looking at it scientifically, almost, that you're trying to be detached.
Thank you very much for that. A little bit more about the film reviewing process. It strikes me from the film reviews that I've read many of your film reviews, not all of them, of course, there's too many really to read within the span of two days or the amount of time I've been preparing for this. You've written voluminous amounts of film reviews. But your writing, from what I perceive, strikes me as very personal, especially within the film reviews. And is this a stylistic choice, or does it come, or is it part of the conventions of film reviewing that you have developed? Is it a stylistic choice, or is it like, part of writing, reviewing films?
It's a stylistic choice, because it's something where you can't, I mean, it is going to seemingly contradict what I just said about trying to be scientific and detached, but you can't be fully objective. It's a fundamentally subjective form of writing. And I try to be honest with readers about where I come from. And like I said, I think the balance that I try to strike is trying to detach my emotions, detach my mood, look at the movie as an average film goer would, to see, almost like a consumer reporter, whether I think it's a quality product, but at the same time acknowledging that I'm subjective. This isn't the same thing as reporting on economic data where there are quantifiable figures that are indisputable. This is something that is ultimately my opinion. And so being more personal about it is a way of acknowledging that this is one person's opinion, and I hope you respect that opinion, but it is still my opinion.
Right. Which leads to my next question, actually. Selecting a lens of analysis for the films that you're reviewing. Is there, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for students in terms of selecting a lens of analysis, just the bare basics of film reviewing, and or inserting their own identities into the film reviews or in their writing in general? So lens analysis and personal identity.
My advice is, everyone, I think, on a gut level knows what their voice is. It's the voice that you read in your free time. It's the voice that you write in when you're not trying to be a writer. And that is your natural voice. So the correct answer for me would not be the correct answer necessarily for all of your students. I would say try to write the kind of stuff that you would want to read, the kind of things that if you were perusing your local library, and that example just dated me, the internet, that that you would click on, that you would pick up from a shelf. So for me, my lens of analysis is I like writing that has a lot of research, that has a more casual style. In terms of film reviews specifically, like I said, I do try to look at it almost like a product, and whether the product, as a consumer reporter, do I recommend this to people in good faith? That's the lens I apply there, but someone else might use a different lens.
Great, yeah. So I mean, I'm trying to inform students. It's like they can choose whatever lens that they feel appropriate. And I think the key here is to be both honest with yourself and honest with your writing about your interpretation of this film, based on the contextual information that you have from that era, perhaps. So in this class, we're looking at films historical films. These are films that employ historical narratives as a backdrop. Films that also directly emphasize the retelling of historical narratives, as well as films as kind of documentary evidence of that historical era in which it's produced. Can you comment on the relationship that you see between films and history and the writing of history, especially within the films that you reviewed? Can you give examples?
Yes, there was a movie I reviewed 1917 about World War One. I'm sure most, at least many of you have heard of it. It was nominated for a number of Oscars. Um, and that was an interesting experience for me because as a film critic, I admired it tremendously. The cinematography is gorgeous. It is innovative in terms of how it's shot. It tells a compelling story. It's not preachy. I admired a lot of it from a craft standpoint. The problem is it completely ignored the geopolitical context of World War One. It ignored how nationalism fueled that conflict. It ignored the corruption of the elites on both sides and how they really were fighting for their own selfish interests and using other people's lives. There was a lot of commentary that just wasn't there. And my review for that film actually was criticized by other critics who said that it doesn't need to have this commentary. The analogy that I put in my review is it would be like making a movie about the Civil War that doesn't mention slavery, or making a movie about World War II that doesn't mention Nazis, where without that knowledge of why World War One was fought and what people thought they were fighting for, you're missing a huge part of the story. And especially right now, when nationalism is resurging in this country and elsewhere, I felt omitting that was a flaw. It didn't mean the movie was devoid of merit. If you go to Rotten Tomatoes and see my review, I did give it fresh. So it's not like I thought it was terrible, but I thought it was lacking as a glimpse into history because it made war seem almost like this impersonal force of nature rather than being what it is, which is a devastating tragedy caused by human action.
Just a few more questions, and it's actually a good segue. I thought in many of your reviews, I think that you draw out a lot of the broader political and social significance of these works of art, particularly in Rambo: The Last Blood. You suggest that the film validates the racist attitudes that are typical among MAGA supporters. So are there other films that you see as engaging directly with political discourse in the US historically and specifically?
I would say, I'm sorry, just to make sure I understand the question, you want to know if there are other movies that engage?
Perhaps you can talk a little bit about your review of an
Of Ram,
analysis of
Ram.
Rambo, and
Yeah,
then
well,
yeah.
Rambo Last Blood specifically, I watched every single movie in that series right before I saw this. I did the same thing for Terminator Dark Fate, where I had like a marathon of watching these movies. It was just me doing my day, my work for Salon and for my PhD, and then it was watching movies about Rambo. And with the Rambo series, all of those movies are explicitly political. All of those movies, I mean, the first film is very clearly a fable about Vietnam War veterans. The second movie is more of the same, but with a more distinctly jingoistic edge to it. You go through the series, it's the same thing. There's the one that's set in Afghanistan, which obviously did not age well, has aged even worse recently than it did when I reviewed Rambo Last Blood. And the reason I looked at that as political is because, and it's interesting because the criticism that you'll hear when you mention the political implications of films is, oh, you're bringing politics into it, but it's actually naive to assume that politics isn't involved in this. Sylvester Stallone is a Republican. He is a very active member of the Republican Party. And his movies involve, a lot of them involve law enforcement or involve the military. He obviously consults people from those agencies, from those institutions, in order to help with his creative process. So all of these things put a political slant in those movies. And each film, as I broke down in my review, when I went through each movie one by one, has political messages. So considering that this is a franchise which had been around for more than 30 years, made by a Republican who has worked with members of what you might call the security state or the police and industrial complex or the military industrial complex. And considering all of that, he releases a movie while Donald Trump was president in which the villains are Mexican, and it takes place against this subtle backdrop of many of the political debates that are occurring, that were occurring then and are still occurring today. And to me, again, like I said about 1917, to ignore that would have been leaving out an important part of the analysis. However, I will add a key difference between the two movies. 1917 was good. It was flawed as a work of history, but it's a genuinely good movie. In addition to being a movie that I thought was extremely racist, Rambo: Last Blood also sucked. So that was, I hope I answered your question.
No, definitely. I guess this is leading to our last question. Politics in films, and well, particularly your review of the Star Wars. Is it Last Jedi? Your review, or is it a different? The Skywalker. So I mean, it occurs to me that film review, your analysis of that film actually took a life of its own. It became the target of many conservative critics. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and how your writing has generated a lot of conversation, particularly among conservative critics?
Well, with The Rise of Skywalker specifically, I view that as a great example of how politics can be projected onto movies by bad actors, because The Rise of Skywalker in itself is a pretty apolitical film. I mean, the whole Star Wars saga does have undertones of resistance against Nazism, so there are politics in there. But what happened with this particular franchise is it became a battleground for other cultural issues, particularly people who are sexist, who are anti-LGBT, who are racist, who do not support diversity and representation. And when the sequel trilogy made Rey into its main protagonist, when John Boyega was cast as Finn, when other creative choices were made, it caused a tremendous amount of repulsive backlash. And the thing with The Rise of Skywalker specifically, it was released after The Last Jedi, which was controversial. I actually did not like The Last Jedi, and I wrote in my review, which I did not send over, but I actually wrote that I don't like the movie, but the people who hate it are behaving so atrociously that I don't want to be associated with them. And so with The Rise of Skywalker, there was, like, within the right, there was this ambivalence of, on the one hand, do we praise it because then we can say the liberal elite critics dislike it and they're out of touch with the ordinary people, or do we bash it because our own base often hates the Star Wars sequel trilogy? And I think initially my review was characterized as negative by the Daily Wire because the narrative they were presenting was these out of touch liberal elite critics all hate a Star Wars movie that average people love. That was the narrative they were presenting in that article, and they mischaracterized my review in order to do so. Then when more fan reactions came out and they saw that their base actually didn't like the sequel trilogy for a bunch of reactionary reasons, their editor-in-chief, Ben Shapiro, had his own review in which he pandered to it, to those emotions. So that's an example of a situation where sentiments on a movie shifted based on what, at least in that situation, they thought would be their base's reactions.
Very interesting. That's pretty much all I have in terms of questions. Is there anything that you wanted to tell generally the class in terms of advice, besides from what you already have given? Anything you want them to know about your work or about film reviewing in general?
I'm going to repeat what I said before. When I started out, there are people in this industry, in every industry, who are going to say discouraging things. The real practice, when Ryan said that I could speak, I was very flattered, and I want to give useful advice. And really, my main advice is two things. have a thick skin, because not everyone who says bad things about you does it because they're telling the truth. I think there is an assumption a lot of people make that if someone is saying something critical, that must be honest, and therefore that must be true. But people are just as likely to say something mean as a lie as they are to say something nice as a lie, perhaps even more so. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is be dependable. I can't stress that enough. Editors have lives, they have families, they have children, they want to move on. If you're a talented writer and you submit your articles on time every time, you will get the job. Even if there's someone else who's talented who isn't reliable, they're not going to get the job. I did not word that sentence well as I was saying it, but I think the gist came across.
I think so too. At this point, if it's all right with you, Matthew, I'm going to turn the camera around and open up a question and answer. Well, first, let's just thank Matthew Rozsa to come over. Valuable insight in the film review process. But if it's all right with you, I mean, I maybe take questions, answers from the audience.
Definitely.
Okay. Let me make sure that you can see everyone out here. Now you cannot at all. Okay, makes this a little bit better. Okay. Oops. All right, does anyone have any questions for Matthew? So we have Mason and then Charles. Okay, Mason, Charles, and then Kevin. Mason, Charles, Kevin. So Mason, floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for all this. I guess.
Sorry, this is not the best setup.
Yeah, I was going to say, Mason, it's a little hard to hear you.
Maybe you could stand up, Mason.
Sure, should I go closer to the microphone?
Would you mind? I mean, I guess that's the way to do it.
Yeah, I would say I think everyone should probably be like center camera when they're talking to me.
Okay, I'm not. Yeah.
Hi, Mason.
That's good. How are you?
Hey.
So when writing a film review, is there a template you stick to? Of course not, because everything's different, but are there certain things you make sure you touch upon?
Yes, the main thing is at the beginning, there is a format that you use in terms of summarizing the movie. If you look at my, certainly the ones I write for Salon, the ones I write for my blog are a little more free form, but the ones I write for Salon, you have to start out by saying, you may have noticed this in every film review that you read, there's usually a couple paragraphs that say, this is the plot, and it has to say blah, 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 and you have to list the actors. Those paragraphs are actually really hard to write because you don't want to spoil anything. So summarizing a movie in a sufficiently comprehensive way that readers can say that you made them adequately informed, but not so comprehensively that you ruin everything and tell them that Rosebud was the sled, which I apologize for that just now. It's not the easiest thing in the world. And I do apologize if I do. I'm not going to tell you what movie I spoiled.
Also, for the next people coming up, the center camera is directly in front of this chair right here, about like right. Yeah, if you want to push it forward, that's good. So I think Charles is up now.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for talking to all of us. My question is, given the recent, can you hear me fine? No?
Yes, yeah, you're talking to me. Yes, I hear you.
Given that movies are now releasing both in the theater and at home, and given that the viewer may be sitting at home rather than at the movie theater, does that change the way you write your review?
I haven't. There's only one movie that I've reviewed in theaters since the pandemic. So it's difficult to say. I can say, yeah, I guess it would, because there's now more of a risk to your health, at least potentially. But at the same time, like I said, it's more of a hypothetical. Like the last movie that I wrote that I saw, I've written movies. I've written movie reviews since the pandemic started, but there's only one movie review that I've written for a movie that I saw in theaters, and that was for A Quiet Place Part 2. Music I actually saw through streaming, and the other movie reviews I've seen also through not theaters.
Okay, Kevin, and does anyone else want to have any questions? Okay, new person, not Gabby, Kathleen, pardon me. So Kathleen next. Anyone else?
All right, Ms. Rosa, thank you so much. And I just wanted to say I enjoyed the Star Wars review immensely because this has been a huge point of contention with me is people who don't enjoy these new movies because they go in expecting some, Oscar-worthy spectacle and don't appreciate it for being Star Wars. That's why you touched a lot on the fan service of The Rise of Skywalker, which I thought was great. I'm all here for fan service as a fanboy of that. I guess I mostly wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed that review.
Well,
But I
thank you.
tried to pull
Thank you
some
so much.
of course, tried to pull some questions out of this. I guess it's a twofold because one I got from your quick talk here about how sometimes maybe that fan service can backfire with how J.J. Abrams then utilized specifically John Boyega's character and then Rose, which I know they had a large role, which you were iffy on in Last Jedi, which I kind of agree is a bit of a red herring. But then it seemed like John Boyega's character, and he's been vocal on this too, was maybe utilized poorly in The Rise of Skywalker. So curious as to what your thoughts on that fan service was. And then a question I've had for a while: how useful and how reflective of the actual sentiment of you and your colleagues is Rotten Tomatoes? Because I go and look it up, and it's like this movie, like Last Jedi, had a 91. But is that, do you often find yourselves agreeing or disagreeing with the overall sentiment of Rotten Tomatoes, and how useful a source is that? If I'm like, do I want to watch this movie or not? So, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the kind words. To answer your first question, and I think I mentioned this in my review. Actually, I did mention this in my review. As the problem was with the way the trilogy was planned. I thought the characters of Finn and Rose had a lot of potential, but with The Last Jedi, their plot really amounts to nothing. It's all I almost wonder if the writers didn't know what to do with them, so they just kind of gave them this side plot that amounted to nothing, and then kind of wiped the slate clean. I thought it was very poorly executed, and the problem was that was the center film in the trilogy. So once you've wasted their plots in that movie, then in the follow-up, where do you go? What do you do? What do you build on? With Finn, the thing they could have built on was what seemed to be his romance with Rey, but they just didn't. They just dropped it. With Rose, they seemed to just drop her character entirely. Now, as I noted, J.J. Abrams was given an unenviable task in terms of having to follow The Last Jedi. And I'm hoping I'm answering your question in terms of just, I think in that situation, they were juggling too many balls at once, and some of them got dropped. And I do think those are flaws in the movie. I'm not sure if I would say that that was due to fan service. I think it was due to poor executive management. I feel like that trilogy should have been entirely directed by J.J. Abrams, or it should have been entirely directed by Rian Johnson or by someone else. There needed to be a single creative vision behind the trilogy. Instead, it was like one person wrote the introduction and the conclusion, and someone with a completely different vision wrote the middle chapter, and the character arcs for Finn and Rose were casualties of that poor choice. In terms of Rotten Tomatoes, I can't speak for my colleagues. My advice, I think Rotten Tomatoes is a great website to find the best reviews. And if you want to see a movie, go to Rotten Tomatoes, look at the blurbs that the different critics choose to put up to represent and summarize their opinions, and then click on those reviews and read them. I think it's a great place to get a sense of what critics are saying in terms of the tomato meter and the percentage ranking. The problem there is that ultimately fresh or rotten is a simplistic metric. So for instance, to refer back to my review of 1917, I gave it fresh because I think it was an entertaining and well-made movie, and I enjoyed it on those levels. But as you heard from my criticisms, simply saying Matthew Rosa says it's fresh doesn't really capture the full opinion that I have. And that's true for every critic. I mean, sometimes it really is just that cut and dried. For instance, music, garbage. I have nothing positive to say about it other than I do like Sia's music, which is not even really the movie. So I have nothing positive to say about it. But I mean, for sometimes it can be more nuanced. And I think when you're going to Rotten Tomatoes, if you see a tomato meter that says 18%, read the reviews, because you might find that a lot of those critics had complicated feelings, and the 18% doesn't necessarily mean it's garbage. It could be a little more subtle than that.
Great questions, by the way. I will say, awesome participation. One more, Kathleen. Does anyone else have any other questions? Sure. Okay. Hussein and who else? Oh, Gabby.
Sort of to pivot the conversation a bit, but I would love to hear more about your process when preparing for an interview with somebody, and also how you go about the interview process.
It depends on who I'm interviewing. Are you talking about specifically for culture pieces or just in general?
In general, but if you want to specify for culture too, that'd be great.
Okay, well, I mean, if it's a culture piece, like obviously I have to read the book or watch the movie or the TV show or whatever before the review or before the interview, and then write up my questions based on that. If I'm interviewing someone, there are interviews where the article focuses on just that person. It's a Q&A where literally the format is just, here is my question, here is their answer. Those obviously require a lot of extensive preparation because I want to make sure that I maximize my opportunity to get information from this person. So for instance, with Jimmy Carter, I really wanted to talk about his views on Donald Trump, who at that point was still president. But there are also a lot of interviews I do for that are just sources for articles. So for instance, I wrote an article a few months ago about mink farms. These are farms where mink are kept and harvested for their fur. I consider them to be inhumane. Those articles weren't about just one person. I interviewed a number of people. And so those interviews, they still require preparation, but not in the same way, because I'm not thinking I have to ask a question and get an answer and keep the script going and make it entertaining as a read. Those are just purely me getting information and trying to extract it. Does that make sense? I hope I answered your question. I
just have a follow-up question for that. It's actually closely related, so if you don't mind me jumping in. And that is, I'm thinking about this particularly lively interview with Roger Stone. I mean, does Salon set you up with these interviews, or is it you have to make your own groundwork, like reaching out to people who you want to interview? How do you land these interviews is my question, because they're pretty remarkable.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a combination of people at Salon helping me, or sometimes I do it on my own. It really does depend on the situation. I keep repeating that answer, and I'm not trying to be repetitive. It's just so for instance with Roger Stone, I actually don't remember how I met Roger Stone. Jeez, it was 20, because I met him when I was freelancing, and I got his email address somehow, and I just emailed him, and he said yes. It was really just, I don't remember how I got his email address, but that was how I got Roger Stone. With Jimmy Carter, I'd interviewed one of his former speechwriters, a man named Stu Eisenstadt, who had a book coming out about his experiences working with Carter. And I just asked him, and he said yes. And so that was how I got that. There have been interviews that were set up through Salon. For instance, Sesame Street was because Salon has a spectacular culture writer named Melanie McFarland, and she knew somebody, and that was how that was arranged. So it depends on the situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Hussein. And anyone else? Does anyone else have questions? Oh, Gabby. Aside from Gabby, Gabby got you on the list. No.
Hey, Mr. Rose, I just want to thank you for your time. I just had a quick question. In our discussion, you talked about maintaining this balance between detaching your emotions and understanding that film reviewing is subjective. So do you suggest any tips in order to help create and maintain that balance when you're writing your own film review?
Yes. Separate the difference between a subjective opinion that reflects on the movie and a subjective opinion that reflects on yourself. So to make that a little less abstract, if you go to the theater and you see the movie and there are jokes that you don't find funny, you can say this movie isn't funny. I actually did that, and I wrote a review for a movie called The Happy Time Murders. It was a Melissa McCarthy comedy, and I was the only person in the theater not laughing. And so in my review, I wrote that the theater was cracking up and I didn't think it was funny. And I did that because I recognize, okay, this is my opinion. I'm not going to say that it's funny when I don't think it's funny just because other people think it's funny. But I also can't, it would be a little disingenuous for me to say, oh, this movie is garbage when I'm surrounded by I'm in an auditorium filled with people laughing hysterically. Now, this is a theater that serves alcohol. So I did note the possible connection between those two.
Okay.
But it was, so that's a situation where even though my opinion is subjective, I noted at the same time that it was still relevant to the film. And I tried to sort of balance that out. On the other hand, the things you need to be careful of is, for instance, there was one movie where on the way over to the theater, I was stuck in traffic. And I planned this because I'm all about being reliable. I left super early. It was just bumper to bumper, horrible traffic. And when I managed to get to the theater on time, and I was with my girlfriend, who is a lot smarter than me, and I was in a bad mood, and she was like, Matt, you got to calm down because you need to be fair to the movie, and you're in a bad mood, and you don't want to say the movie is terrible just because you're in a bad mood. And I did my best, and that's another thing. So does that make sense? I hope I'm explaining the distinction well.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Great question, by the way.
Thank
Okay,
you.
last one, Gabby, you have any question? Okay, and if anyone else wants to jump in, I'll put you on the queue. Oh, yes, Ally.
Hi. So, Sears music is, as you say in your review, like just a bad and ableist portrayal of autism. But are there any works that you think are good portrayals of autism, or at least positive, that you genuinely enjoy?
Yes, there is a show on the network Freeform called Everything's Gonna Be Okay. I really like that, and I've written reviews recommending it. That one I thought was good. There was I'm trying to think of something. It was on the tip of my brain. I can't. There's an indie film. I'm gonna remember it as soon as the lecture is over, after all of you have left. But there's another movie I saw that I liked. Go check it out. I don't know the title.
Okay. Ally and then Tia.
I was just wondering, like, somebody already kind of asked about your like format of writing film reviews, but I was wondering, do you approach it as more of you're writing like a specific, you have a thesis or an argument you're making, or just kind of talking about general feelings?
If it's a review, I view it as like reviewing a product, as saying whether it's good or bad. There are pieces that I've written about movies that aren't reviews, but they're still about movies. And I think I'm glad you asked that question because it's an important distinction to make. There is a difference between writing a review and doing a think piece. So for instance, I wrote a review for the movie Joker. And then I wrote later on a think piece about how Joker depicts mental illness and how that intersects with the gun control debate, because I'm not going to spoil anything, but there is an intersection. And so that was a think piece. And so for that piece, I had a thesis, because that was after I'd seen the movie, after I'd reviewed it, after I'd had time to digest it. And I had an observation about a specific aspect of the film. The review was more of just a straightforward, I didn't have any thesis. I just watched the movie, took notes, and wrote down my thoughts.
Great question. Tia. Anybody else want to jump on here on the queue? No? Okay.
Hi. When writing a review, do you read other writers' reviews so to make sure you're not writing like the same article somebody's writing, or like read them to make like a counterpoint, or that you felt that they felt strongly about that you may not feel strongly about?
I am glad you asked, because I actually do have a process there. I write the initial review without reading what anyone else says, and then I go back after reading what people say just to see if there's, like, for instance, with my Rise of Skywalker review, I noted the Rotten Tomatoes score, but I didn't want to see anything before the movie because I didn't want to be biased. So I try to split the difference in a sense of seeing the movie without preconceptions, but I also do need to have some awareness of what the conversation is about the movie before I write about it.
And then my second question is, I work with children on the autism spectrum, and I know sometimes become fixated on a genre or a topic. Do you find yourself more liking movies that you find yourself fixated on than not like having a fair opinion on movies you just generally don't like?
I'm sorry, I'm a little unclear what your question is.
Like, I work with children on autism spectrum, and they like things, certain things more than like other things. So when you review movies, do you find yourself being more appeasing to genres you like than you dislike?
Oh, I see. No, I don't. I mean, I have my genre preferences, but for instance, I love horror movies. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Westerns, but I'd rather watch a well-made Western than a bad horror movie. I'd rather watch No Country for Old Men than Smiley. So, I try to not do that. I mean, again, do I know my own biases innately? No. If I did, then I would be able to purge them. But I do try to avoid having genre bias.
Great question. Anyone else? No? Yeah, sure.
This is a quick question because you just mentioned horror, and my mom is terrified of scary movies, so she would just like assume that I would be the same. And I recently started watching horror movies, and now I'm all into it. So, what is your favorite horror movie? Because I want to know.
That's a dangerous question to ask me. Have you ever seen Trick or Treat? When I say Trick or Treat, I spell R. The movie spells R with just the letter R. So it's trick and then the letter R and then treat. It is a very clever anthology, but it doesn't have a linear narrative. Each story is interwoven with the others. It's kind of it can be difficult to follow, but if you enjoy an experimental format and you really are into like the season of Halloween and all of the tropes of Halloween, especially now that it's October, I would highly recommend it. So it's called Trick R with the letter R, Treat. It was released in 2007, I believe.
Question. Anybody else? Is that it? Okay, Mason, yeah, follow up.
I used to be like a big film buff, but as of late, TV and movies just don't strike my fancy as much. Although I did see a recent movie called Malignant. Have you seen it? And it kind of inspired my love for movies again a little bit.
I've seen it, and
what are your thoughts on it?
It was a very scary movie. I enjoyed it quite a bit. So yes, I believe Ari Aster also directed Midsummer, which I wrote a review of. I believe it was directed by the same guy.
It was James Wan.
Okay. Well, nevertheless, I do recommend it as well. Even if I got the director wrong, I apologize, James Wan.
Well, I'm sure you have many directors' names in your mind because of all the films you review. I'm really astounded by your oeuvre of film reviews, but also you think pieces on society and culture as well. If there's no more questions, I just wanted to thank you once again for coming and speaking with us about film reviewing and about your work generally. So if everyone can give Matthew a round of hand, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. At this time, I think we're going to take a short break. So people can use the bathroom. We've been up here, for a little bit now. And then we're going to come back and we have a brief lecture about the historical context of Mr. Blanding's Builds a Dream House and situating that film within the era of suburbanization. But of course, it's not all that meets the eye. There's actually a much richer, deeper backstory to that film and that era as well. So I guess we'll come back. I'll give everyone maybe like 7 minutes. We'll come back 7:10. We'll kick off that lecture, an analysis of the film. And also because of the unusual structure for today, we're actually not going to be looking at film reviews as we normally do, but rather, to get everyone to the Ram band that needs to, we'll get out of here by 8:15. Okay. All right. So everyone come back at 7:10. Okay. So Matthew, thank you very much for hanging out and talking with us. Did you want to hang out and for the lecture or not? I mean, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I was initially going to, but actually I want to look into what was going on with my mic. It seems to be fixed now, but this is a work computer. So if you don't, I hope you don't mind. I actually do want to check into this.
No problem at all. Again, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Could you send me a copy of the video?
We will. Yeah, I'll stop it right now and we'll go. Thanks again.
Thank you. Take care.